Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In this mini-series, over summer 2026, we're looking at the future of US military in terms of C2. Not the CJAD C2 system or from a joint commander's perspective necessarily, but rather a look in depth at each of the US military services and their aspiration. And this is important and timely. Big changes are coming for each service. They differ from each other and the way they've historically organised their C2. In this episode, we're talking about battlefield health with retired Major General Ed Dorman. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic Incorporated, we provide innovative commercial C2 software solutions. Our SID-aware suite of products accelerates decision-making in contested environments and enables data sharing with partners and allies. Our open platform uses public APIs to connect sensors, shooters, autonomous systems, and mission applications without the need to replace existing hardware.
Now, when we normally talk about C2, we usually think about the sharp end of combat and war, right? Planning, orders, deconfliction, coordination. We focus on fires, maneuver, and synchronization. On the main Command and Control show, we've talked about logistics, sustainment, supply, replenishment, resilience, and capacity in sort of stovepipes. But what we haven't talked about is battlefield health, battlefield medicine. This is a noteworthy omission that some of you have picked up. Whether in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, or any other contemporary conflict, one cannot help but acknowledge and understand the way their commanders prioritize casualty reporting, health data, and health management as a core facet of understanding their own forces, how to deploy, and how to use them. To quote from a paper by Lieutenant General Mary Izaguirre, the 46th Surgeon General of the US Army, and Brigadier General Bill Schultz in the AUSA magazine from October 25, quote, "The conflict between Ukraine and Russia offers a contemporary example of why fully integrated command and control is critical. Ukraine's ability to counter Russian advances has hinged on its coordination with partner nations and its integration of intelligence, logistics, and battlefield operations. By leveraging real-time data shared across coalition networks, Ukraine has been able to maximize the effectiveness of limited resources, rapidly repositioning forces, and respond to evolving threats." They go on. This level of synchronization enables and demonstrates the value of combined arms and joint all-domain operations. The lesson for the US Army and its allies and partners is clear. Success on future battlefields will depend on seamless integration across all warfighting functions. And this is the important bit, with Army medicine fully represented. So I get while this is true. The historical model, however, for data capture across US Army formations, let alone across the joint and combined force, has been stovepiped and separate. There is certainly an ambition to harmonize, centralize, and share, but the reality is some way from the ambition. And so to my guest today, retired Major General Ed Dorman. Ed is a proven combat leader and master logistician. There may be those in the audience who recall when he commanded an infantry rifle company in the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault back in 1988. But Ed is probably better known more recently as the Director, Logistics and Engineering, J4 US CENTCOM, before retiring on the 31st of December 2018. In this position, he was responsible for strategic policy planning and guidance of the logistics support. Now, this is all elements of supply, transportation, and construction for over, get this, 300,000 US and multinational personnel conducting combat and support operations in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and 17 other Middle East and South Asian nations. Ed worked in the Pentagon on the US Army's retrograde, reset and redistribution, the R3 task force, managing the influx of equipment from combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan in order to maintain accountability, repair assets, and redistribute them as needed across the force. Since retiring, Ed has worked as a senior vice president and chief operating officer of S10 Consulting. He's a leadership fellow at the AUSA, serves as a highly qualified expert and senior mentor with the Army's Mission Command Training Program. And in this role, Ed mentors and advises corps, divisions, theatre, and expeditionary commanding generals and their staff on that most important facet of going forward, sustaining large-scale combat operations. Moreover, Ed is chair of the NDIA Contested Logistics Subcommittee and a member of the NDIA Energy Committee. As important and relevant to today's discussion, Ed has concerns for the complexities and challenges of battlefield medicine and healthcare. At this point, I should point out that Major General Dorman's remarks and views expressed here are his own and not necessarily representative of any other organisation. Ed, long intro. Welcome to the show. Thanks for squeezing us into your hectic schedule and numerous diverse responsibilities. Let's get right to it. I get that medical treatment requires C2, but we're not really talking about how to command medics and hospital staff, right? What is it that C2 needs to provide the commander in terms of battlefield medicine, healthcare, and all that stuff?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to your audience for listening. You're absolutely correct, right? We have to reframe this from a battlefield medicine, from a purely medical discussion, right? Medical and logistics is always thought about after the fact. This is a command and control issue. It's more importantly a sustainment synchronization issue. It's a battlefield circulation issue and a combat power regeneration issue, right? And the discussion is much bigger than directing medics or hospital staffs. What command and control must provide in future warfare, when we're talking about large-scale combat operations, you got to have visibility, you got to have synchronization, you got to have prioritization, you got to ensure you understand movement, the sustainment integration, because you're not going to have sufficiency of assets. So it's not just, do I have enough ambulances or do I have enough rotary wing or others? And I've got to understand what my maneuver plan is, and I've got to keep things in circulation constantly. I've got dedicated assets and I've got non-standard assets. And I have to understand that everything has to be prioritized with backhaul and everything is synchronized. And ultimately, that'll enable me to regulate and ensure I've got those critical beds emptied on time. And I've got the ability to regenerate that combat power. And what we learned during Iraq and Afghanistan was how to save lives exceptionally well tactically, right? We had TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. We had forward surgery, rapid evacuation, trauma system integration, and en-route care. And those lessons absolutely matter. But operationally, GWOT was bad for what we're going to face in large-scale combat operations because it conditioned us to expect air superiority, sanctuary logistics, uninterrupted communications, reliable evacuation timelines, and uncontested rear areas, or even uncontested forward areas, right? We are going to be contested, as we have seen in the Ukraine, as we have seen in Operation Epic Fury, and as we will see in the Pacific, which is a huge challenge. And when you think about the contestation in the Pacific across 3 island chains that operate similar to a mesh network that will be contested in each of those island chains, it is going to be hugely difficult. That's why you have to have exceptional command and control. You have to have synchronization. You have to have prioritization. In some cases, you're going to have pulsed windows where you have convergence of capability. That takes exceptional command and control operations. And if you think about, you talked about Ukraine, and I think about the warfighter exercises where you talked about me being a senior mentor and my contemporaries. We go in as general officers and we talk from our own experience as senior mentors. What it's showing us are our assumptions collapse very quickly in peer conflict. Now, battlefield health becomes a sustainment problem, a transportation problem, a movement control problem, a protection problem, because you got to protect those casualties as you're getting them out. And fundamentally, this command and control problem that you talk about at the tactical edge, at the operational edge, and then you think about it in a place like the Pacific, Transcom gets involved, United States Transportation Command, and its assets, because it's got the longer legs to get it out across multiple island chains back to the continental United States, right? Across the care. And so, when I talk about the Army Mission Command Training Program describing casualty operations, it's about personnel replacement, mortuary affairs, and detainee operations. Collectively, we talk about it as human commodities competing for limited transportation and sustainment resources. To me, that's a profound conceptual shift, if you will. So I would say battlefield medicine is no longer just a medical support function. It's a combat power preservation function. That's why you have to think about that. So that's why it's fundamentally a command and control problem. Hope that sheds some light on it.
Yeah, it does. I was struck when you were talking there that whenever I've worked in headquarters and we were thinking about medical, it wasn't just an afterthought. It was seen as a slow go function, no go function. It always felt like the medical concerns were always about drawing stuff out. They were always taking away things from theatre. It was never about this adds to morale, this adds to fighting capability. It's always about you're taking away bits from me. And then I need to add people for medical support and add, a tier 3 hospital facility. And it was always an embuggerance rather than anything else, right? It always got in the way. And commanders viewed it a bit like they viewed legal issues. It was like, oh God, I got to deal with this now. This is crazy. There's a distinct mind shift change that you're talking about here, right? Is that hard to sell?
No, I don't think it is. I think when you talk about it from a command and control problem, remember, I'm commanding people and I'm communicating with people. And the better I do medical and the better I'm able to command and control my forces and communicate with them, that my ability to understand the casualties that I'm going to have and that I've got a plan for maneuvering them across the battlefield to the quickest point of care and the ability to evacuate them to the point of treatment that's best suited for them in the fastest manner, or the best treatment for them to keep them alive, will keep them fighting harder, right? Because if they know they're going to be taken care of, they're going to fight harder. And I have seen that firsthand in combat in Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen my soldiers fight harder because of that. And if they know that we have that planned out in a PACE plan, we've got a primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency plan for getting them to the right place that will keep them alive longer and get them returned to the fight, then they're going to fight that much harder. And that takes some real command and control when you're looking at that kind of PACE plan. That doesn't just happen. That takes a lot of thinking. That takes a dynamic bit of integration and ability to have flexibility. So you're constantly thinking through. That is the penultimate or the ultimate success in command and control. I think when you can think on your feet and adjust. And then in some cases, if I can use techniques that we have seen in Ukraine and other places when they become almost semi-permissive or denied, using command and control of, let's say, other capabilities to keep soldiers alive longer, right? I still have to command that and control that capability as well, right? Then I'm going to keep soldiers alive. So I'm preserving combat power because command and control is to preserve the force, extend endurance. There's all those things embedded in the command and control features. So there's an art, a science, and a little bit more to the command and control piece, if that makes sense.
It does. And I'm struck when you talk about this, the impact on soldiers fighting harder and maintaining the edge and pushing the envelope because they have faith in the system. That faith in the system is built quite a long time beforehand, right? You can't just suddenly go, here it is. You've not seen this stuff before, but they have to have faith that it's there in exercise, in workup, in deployment training, all this stuff. They need to understand that. I'm struck by thinking about the British example in the Falkland Islands, establishing the battlefield hospital in San Carlos Water, very famous Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly, operating in extremes down there, 8,000 miles away from support. And then you have the examples of medical support in Korea during the Korean War, again, which was very different. But these are the extremes, Edge. When you're talking about large-scale combat operations now in the Pacific, we're talking those extremes of geography where we can't have all those facilities on hand in every island, in every place. They're going to have to be selective, and somehow we're going to have to deal with the unexpected, exactly as you say.
And then think about the other command and control piece where you have, at least in the United States Army, so you have these large hospital sets, and you don't need all of that capability at one time. So how do you break it down into its modular components per operational? So, I'm in my forward battle position, then I'm doing the river crossing, I'm in the penetration zone, and then I have to stop for a hasty defense or I'm counterattacking, those types of things. I have to have the right medical capability for the right operational mission set that I'm doing. And then I have to have that right medical capability there. And it takes a lot of capability often to move that right medical set because they're set up in these It takes a lot of trucks and a lot of capability to move all that, get it into place, get the protection, get the logistics around it. And I don't always need that. It may come with x-ray and gynecology and all these other things that I don't need. So now I've got to undo it, get it configured, get it to the right place, and kind of do some predictive analytics as a commander. That's my command and control using estimate of the situation to really understand the synchronization and command and control of all the elements that support that, getting it into place at the right time for that maneuver, recognizing that the enemy has a vote. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm struck by this idea that medical becomes an enabler to the commander's plan rather than a bugbear, right? It becomes absolutely phenomenal. In the same way that modern commanders think more about logistics in those ways. Logistics is never about, I can't support you doing a 30-mile penetration. Logistics is about, well, if we go this way, I can support this. If you go this plan heavy, I can support that. It's very medical is the same. It's got to be regarded in that same way as an enabler, not a take back. But it also strikes me from what you were saying that the lessons that we, coalition, allied, specifically here the US, took from Iraq and Afghanistan, some of those aren't necessarily as relevant as those that are coming out of contemporary combat operations. And that's a big change for commanders to take in. The institutional memory, we know a lot of big institutions are like, we know what we're doing, muscle memory, we kick in here. That takes quite some change.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think GWAT conditioned us in a bad way because we got complacent like we did with logistics and sustainment. We send out the same logistic convoy package every time because that's kind of what they needed. But that's not what we're going to do in large-scale combat operations because we're going to have the operational flexibility that we won't be able to always count on. So we've got to be nimble on our feet. We have to be thinking about in time, space, task, and purpose. And every lesson that we learn from the Ukraine is important, but it's not always applicable in the same way in a different battle space. And we have to be cautious of that. And since I'm a retired general officer, I can now say, hey, not so quick. Don't drink the Kool-Aid because people are getting on the bandwagon, especially with unmanned systems. They want to apply the same lesson. I've been into Ukraine 4 times since the war started, and each time I see something new and different. And it's amazing what they're doing there, tremendously amazing, and how they're fighting and the things that they're doing. I would caution, even in some of the articles that I read and the ones you read up front, maybe if you're not on the ground there seeing it, it is a different fight depending on the different type of brigade you were in and the different location you were in, what's going on, even from the logistics. They're sometimes having to self-source, go down to the local Home Depot and do what they got to do, just because that is the nature of the fight. It is a hybrid type of capability for resourcing yourself, doing combat casualty care. It's not the same that we would do here, so we have to be cautious there. But I would say it's a fundamentally command and control problem. It is something we have to think about very deliberately. And what I have seen in some of my senior mentor actions is that it's a collaborative effort across the sustainers. And often the medical officer has a great fear of telling the deputy commanding general for sustainment, hey, boss, the number of soldiers we're going to lose is in the thousands on this operation. That's a pretty hard pill to swallow for a division commander or assistant division commander. They're not necessarily going to want to hear that. Well, what do you mean it's going to be in the thousands? And so sometimes they're not willing to speak up like that. That is also something we're going to have to get over.
Now, I'm struck as well by the differentiation you place in Ukraine. Not every lesson is right, and the lessons from Ukraine aren't the same as the Israelis learned in Gaza. They're not the same that you get out of Sudan or elsewhere. One of the things when we're talking about potential US operations in the Pacific Indian Ocean, the scale and the geography mean that it's not going to be entirely a US Army or US Marine Corps or US Navy support. It's going to be a hybrid, all those things. But also then you've got host nation capabilities as well. And somehow the C2 system has got to maintain this awareness across a really diverse set, whereas Army Medical used to do US Army Medical stuff. And that was difficult because everything was stovepipe, care was stovepipe, systems was so, data was stovepipe. Now you've got not just with the US Army, but you're going to have naval facilities, marine facilities, air force facilities, and host nation facilities, civilian and military, right? So it's a really complex problem, surely.
And then talk about command and control. That's a joint, combined, interagency, intergovernmental, and industrial, right? If you think about organizations like ISOS, which operate in there, and you think about host nation, you also have to understand what are the limitations within a host nation that you can and cannot use. How much drain does that place on the host nation? Because that places them at risk. You can't necessarily go in there and start draining down their capability. So all of these things place limitations and constraints on it. And that makes the command and control of understanding the resourcing behind that. It's not just about commanding and controlling a maneuver, but commanding, controlling at a much more operational and strategic dimension of all of the things that have to be commanded and controlled and agreements that have to be reached. So now you're getting back up into levers of power. So you're not at the tactical edge doing command and control, but you're into diplomacy and agreements. You're into information. You're into intelligence about the capabilities in the host nation and, the local communities. And you're into the economy, right? And how much capabilities they have. And then the military capacity in there. And then you're also into something else from an intelligence standpoint of, if I'm in the Pacific, there are different types of diseases and there are much different things that go on from a medical standpoint that I have to think about than in Europe and in the Ukraine or in the Middle East, right? That I have to take into account. And people will say, what does that have to do with command and control? It has everything to do with command and control.
Right. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with Steve Leonard about logistics in large scale operations. And the response, particularly from industry, is often, listen, data can solve this. Provided you can provide us with clean data, then we can make everything transparent, visible to whoever you need. We can provide perfect situational awareness and all that stuff that comes with it. And I'm struck with the new NGC2 and C2 fix for the US Army, these big systems that are coming in. There seems to be a response that it's okay because we'll have the data and it will solve everything. But these challenges can't just be talked over with data provides the answer, right? Or can they?
They can't, because usually that data is structured data and it's curated. And it's curated through a lens from an analyst that's giving you a dashboard, because we're so fixated with dashboards and curated data that we don't understand the nuanced essence of the unstructured data behind it that gives us really the true information that we're looking for, that allows us to do the estimates of the situation and do the forecasting that is really hyper important down at the very baseline level, so that analysts and medics and people who are looking at medicines in the logistics supply chain, or understanding about the test, measurement, diagnostic evaluation of the medical equipment that has to be used and how long it's been out in the field and when it needs to be repaired. All of that has to be synchronized and ensured that it's in the right place at the right time, so that I can do the medical operations that have to be synchronized in time, space, task, and purpose in line with a given operation. So again, I go back to prioritization, synchronization, and the command and control of all the supporting functions that are supporting the operational execution, right? Which is being commanded and controlled. And it's almost like if I'm talking about digital realm and data, then I would be building digital twins, right? With use cases to ensure that I have the data that would support those, so I could use machine learning, deep learning, agentic capabilities that would help me accelerate that, but making sure I had a human in the loop to understand it, so I could accelerate my decisioning perhaps in my OODA loop on command and control to ensure my estimates were correct, my predictions were correct. That might be better than just having data, right? And saying, okay, the data lake is going to spit me out an answer and that's going to help me, because I have to have confidence in what it's telling me. And I only have that if I'm an experienced commander or I'm an experienced operator, right? As a medic or a field surgeon or things like that. And I can estimate based on the operation I'm in, whether it's a defense or an offense or a meeting engagement with this type of force. I have to think about the correlation of forces in the terrain I'm at. All of those factors in the weather and all of those things I have to take into consideration for battlefield medicine based on the type of injuries I'll probably sustain in the location and the environment. The Pacific is much different than the European, is much different than the Middle East, is much different than the Arctic.
So if structured data, as you've articulated very clearly, is not the biggest challenge, thinking about battlefield medicine, what's the biggest challenge that the US Army is going to face in the sort of short, medium term?
I think the biggest probably is synchronization under contested conditions, I would think, or protection maybe, because we kind of got, maybe the future challenge is protected throughput of medicine, not boutique medicine. We kind of got used to boutique medicine, perhaps. We became conditioned by the golden hour because we had uncontested airspace. We had overwhelming logistics superiority. We had a mature theater infrastructure wherever we went. We always say, hey, we're the only nation on earth that can project power at a time and place of our choosing and sustain it indefinitely. But that has changed. We are now contested from the heartland of the United States forward. And I think places like the Ukraine we are seeing suggest that future warfare requires prolonged field care, which we've not had to experience. You've got to have this distributed and dispersed treatment, which makes everything much harder. We can no longer have these large field hospitals and footprints, right? Everything has to be dispersed and disaggregated, making a much smaller footprint, oftentimes on the go, right? I'm almost operating out of the back of a vehicle, quickly set up, low signature, right? From protection standpoint, I can't have a signature. So I'm almost back to a Korea-style mobile armory surgical hospital that moves quickly. So it's prolonged field care, distributed treatment, decentralized evacuation, and maybe multimodal patient movement. So I'm moving them across different modes. And the future challenge is probably not simply speed, it's maybe resiliency of throughput under attack as I'm moving casualties, especially across the island chains in the Pacific. So it's that resiliency. So I would say probably a future challenge is protected throughput instead of the boutique medicine that we've become used to, right? We get them to a location, we've got all these bells and whistles. So again, I think it's a future challenge. Most difficult is probably protected throughput, not boutique medicine. I think that's the most important there.
Yeah, and it also strikes me that coming out of that therefore there's going to be some issues between the legacy systems, multiple, that US Army medical, healthcare, all that stuff is operating on, and the new system that is supposed to provide this ability to be distributed and seamless and transparent and perfect. That's a huge ask, right, on the people, and almost a different set of skills. You might be doing the same operation, but you're doing it in an entirely different place. And there's an expectation that you will have the data and at least the patient details before they arrive with you. But battlefield casualties, they pass through many hands. So what are the implications of handling personal health information within the overall C2 system as patients move from point of injury to other levels of care?
Well, I think one of the things that are really difficult is this casualty tracking and health situational awareness. So that challenge is because it's often still treated administratively rather than operationally. So now, just like we were doing Merck chat as operators, we're coming up in comm windows, all of that is a digital signature. And so when we're transmitting, we're targetable. And so casualty awareness will directly drive combat power assessments, sustainment priorities, replacement forecasting, evacuation planning, and commander decision making. But you can't be transmitting all the time. And then I've also got to have in-transit visibility of where are my assets en route to me, when are they loaded, where are my human commodities, where are they at any one time in the battle space, so I understand that I'm getting ready to receive them, right? So I'm prepared. I'm getting them ready for the next leg of the journey, all of that. And so the problem in large scale combat operations, depending on where you are, is that the network degrades. We talk about the DDIL, denied, degraded, intermittent, and limited. So networks degrade, systems disconnect, command posts displace all the time. You have to be moving, and the digital signatures become targetable. As soon as I step out with a phone or some kind of, even if I've got remote LinkedIn, and we have seen this in Ukraine constantly. On my last trip there, we were using some robotics to try and do evacuation. And of course, the drones saw it. They were about 800 meters away, even trying to spoof it off. And the robotic ground system that was evacuating got schwacked. So it was a bad deal. So that digital signature, that problem isn't building a better dashboard with digits, and problem is maintaining that trusted awareness while the battlefield itself is fragmenting. I think when you talk about digits and sending signals and understanding where things are. So data without this survivability, again, protection, I go back, sustainment and protection have to work together, medical and protection, because medical is a part of the sustainment warfighting function, logistics, medical, HR, finance, legal. Data without survivability is not situational awareness. And without situational awareness, you can't command and control. So every transmission creates a signature, right?
Yeah, it does. And I'm struck by what you're saying, that it feels like a very human set of considerations. Where you and I would go back to warfare being a distinctly human endeavor. But the discussions about C2 seem to focus more and more on digital networks, on data banks, structured data, on agentic learning, AI, large language models. The latter seem to be at the heart of discussions about C2 systems, when the medical side, in order to bring it up to be this enabler for combat power, seems to be a much more human set of considerations. How are they going to mesh together? Because you've got large headquarters, they're desperately shrinking people that are working really hard to move to fully digital headquarters that can be dispersed and moved and separated. And that doesn't lend itself to the kind of human interactions and judgment that you're talking about. How do you foresee that? Is that going to necessarily sync? Is it going to go head to head? Is that a tension? I don't understand how these things might align.
So what we're talking about is interoperability, right? We want to get to interoperability. That matters more now than it ever did. So I think the reason we had these huge headquarters, my section as a J4 at CENTCOM went from an original modified table of organizational equipment from 65 people before the global war on terror to almost 400 people. And I was given the 400 people to do all of these at echelon, reviewing and working things. But we really didn't need all that. So now with AI, I could automate some of those tasks that were just, hey, I'm reviewing something, I'm trying to see. So smart use of digitization and machine learning and deep learning and large language models and agentics could be done by those agents with people in the loop. And then because we have to think about interoperability across people that don't speak the same languages, that don't really think the same ways. They're just as smart as one another. And maybe that will help us bridge some of that interoperability. And what I saw in Afghanistan and Iraq a lot of times was we had allies and partners who were brilliant, but because they didn't speak English or the same language, they tend to get put in a different place as if they weren't as smart. Not true. And so if we use this to help us, maybe we could reduce the footprint and the people, use the agents and use more than large language models. Large language models in and of themselves are okay, but I think the agentic, the deep learning, machine learning can help us really enhance what we're doing and give us better answers, better predictions, so that our command and control and our decision making, we could almost create a decision intelligence layer that would help us be more interoperable and do some things better. So no fight is unilateral. I think casualty have to move through, as you said, Army, coalition, all the other different, even civilian hospitals, rail systems, commercial transportation, all that. If we're using digital and AI, we can also see those things in real time, get the answers better. People know them because of where they come from. We can create better intermodal joint evacuation networks that leverage the civilian infrastructure. I think if we don't do that, we'll run into fragmented systems that'll result in delay, confusion. duplication of effort, and probably will lose visibility. So we'll be looking for people, and that's not what we want, because that kind of delay will cost us lives.
Yeah, and losing people in a hospital system in some third-party state is also, there's a risk to the operational data and knowledge that that person holds, right? I mean, there's the tracking of those people is really fundamental. There's got to be some medical appreciation to the balance of risk between what an injured soldier officer knows about the plan and sharing their data with the hospital and then getting the effective treatment. The risk has got to weigh off somewhere. And you feel like, again, this is one of those human considerations that you don't want to pass over to a machine because they're not about strict yes or no decision. They're about a judgment, right?
That's right. That's a human continuity book. We don't want to lose that human that has knowledge and experience. That can't be replaced by anything. So we want a casualty care system, evacuation system, return to duty system that is multimodal, distributed, constantly moving, getting them to the right place in the right time so we can quickly get them back into the fight rather than letting them languish and perhaps getting worse and ultimately, losing that knowledge, and that's loss of combat power. So that brings us a full circle back to command and control, complete visibility of what we're doing, and having the mastery of all of our assets in time, space, task, and purpose towards a common purpose. That's what command and control is all about, and having it focused on what we need.
And exactly as you said earlier, the impact of this on individual soldiers and therefore through them, the fighting power that you're exercising, the ability to know that your battle buddy has been treated, is okay, will return to duty, or is in a safe place on his way back to the state you're in. That has a huge impact on morale. We've seen that everything from the First World War all the way through, understanding, particularly in small units that the army fights in, understanding what's happening to your comrades who've been off and injured, and the ability to understand that has a huge impact on fighting power, right?
Absolutely, because buddies are going to go look for other buddies. Where are they? Are they at that hospital? Because I'll be more concerned going to find them than I am in actually doing my job sometimes. If I've got a chance to go and find them, that's taking time away, because that's what we fight for. We fight for the person on the left and right, not necessarily for the political ideology or for something else. And left to ourselves, we're going to go find them and make sure they're all right. So again, it contributes to the fighting power.
And I guess this has got to be my final question because we're running out of time. But I was struck when I was talking to people in the US Army and the US Marine Corps, US Navy, about their new C2 system, whether it's NGC2 or JADC2 or CJADC2.
Not a real system, by the way. I'll just say that as a retired guy.
I mean, all this stuff that people talk about, that medical doesn't feature in their considerations at all. The current system that people are after is an intelligence system that's being morphed into do lots of other things. Do you think that there is the danger that medical considerations, medicine considerations, and healthcare considerations in the new Uber C2 system that is being developed institutionally will be ignored, bypassed, and therefore be less than optimal? Or do you think that at some point it'll be okay and it'll catch up and everything will be fine?
No, I don't, because if there's one thing I know as a reformed operator, right, as I was in the first part of my career, that's just the way we look at things, right? We are the operators and the barrel-chested freedom fighters at the front line of freedom, and all the rest are the rest in the rear with the gear. But that's not the case. From the front to the rear, everyone is important because everyone contributes to the tip of the spear. And so we fundamentally have to understand how important it is that if I'm on the front line, that person that's in the medical or the sustainer is just as equally important out there driving around the battlefield, evacuating or delivering the bullets to me because they're getting fired at. They're fixing me up when I get shot. So we are a team. And if we don't look at it like that, I tell you, in an operational detachment alpha in SF or in the Rangers, both the places I've served, we depend on the medics because they will save our lives. And so it's interesting that we look at those differently than we look at the others, but we're all equally important. And our leadership at the highest level needs to understand from an institutional perspective, all of the capabilities are equally important. So we must invest in them and place emphasis on them equally, right? And that's why we say our warfighting functions, they have to be integrated equally. Only then are they the sum of all their parts and have the strength. So I really appreciate it. And so I would just say, the army that wins the future war may not be the army that avoids casualties. It may be the army that regenerates combat power faster than the enemy can destroy it. And it can only do that if it's done what you just said. Thinks about the sustainment and the medical function, which is a part of that sustainment warfighting function, with protection and bringing it to bear in an important way. So thank you so much for the ability to be a part of this podcast. It's been great. I really appreciate it.
And huge honor to have you on the show. On behalf of the audience, we're most grateful to you sparing your time from your crazy, chaotic diary. Thanks for sharing all those experiences. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 18 NATO members. SitAware is an industry-leading command and control software suite that is cloud-enabled, edge-capable, and coalition-ready.
We hope you enjoyed the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do hit or like and subscribe buttons. The episode is produced by Release.com as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.